Hello! How's everyone doing? Awesome. I'm Tamar, and today I'm going to be talking about community engineering. I'll use community engineering and social media engineering interchangeably in this talk. I wanted to start by talking about, come in! All right. I wanted to start by talking about a very special building in Brooklyn. This is a photo inside of that building. Now, 50 people in this building speak a language called Seke. And Seke is an indigenous language of Nepal. And it's also what's called an endangered language. So what that means is that there are so few speakers of this language in the entire world that linguists are kind of actively trying to preserve it. And there are about 700 people in the world that speak this language, and 50 of them, 50 people who speak this language live in the same building in Brooklyn. This story came out recently in the New York Times, and I was so inspired by it. For many communities, social media is that building. Social media, at its best, is a platform and a place where people can find other people with very similar and important interests to them, where they can deeply connect and celebrate their culture and create a better world together. And in this building in Brooklyn, the residents have an opportunity to preserve their culture because they live so close to one another. I really love this story probably because of my background. I'm a first-generation American. I'm bilingual. I speak Hebrew and English. My parents are from Israel. And I'm also a community app developer, which is what the majority of my work as an engineer has been building social media apps. So I thought I would start by kind of figuring out who's here. We're in Singapore, which is such a multicultural place. And I thought I would start by having everyone shout out the languages that they speak. So are you guys ready? You're with me? Okay, cool. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and just say all the languages that you speak, okay? All right. 1, 2, 3. Amazing. Yeah, it's such a special opportunity to come speak here. And I didn't hear any of what you guys said, but I heard a lot of noise, so I know that's a lot of languages. Yes, so today I'm going to be talking about building technology for communities. I'm going to share some stories about technical decisions and how they evolved on projects that I've worked on. What's really interesting about building social media is that it's a dialogue. Now, all products that you build are a dialogue, right? A product means somebody uses what you're building, and there's always a person on the other side. But what's very interesting about social media is that the people on the other side are also talking to one another. And on top of the technology you're building, they're cultivating something that's very, very important to them. Not to say anything bad about banking apps or something like that, or Venmo, but there's kind of a rich culture developing on top of social media apps. And so it's very important to constantly listen to your community and evolve both from a technical and product standpoint. And what does it mean that the community you're building for evolves? A couple of things. The number of users might change. Consumer technology changes. Like people maybe start to use iPhones more. They have different demands. Users seek new ways of expressing themselves. Bad actors join the community. We could see from the biggest social networks at scale that this is inevitable, and so it's very important that engineers of community apps are thinking about the inevitability that bad actors will come in and how to respond to that and make the community safe and positive. And then sub-communities with different needs will also form, and you'll have to think about, as your community becomes more diverse, how do you support the different needs that people have in your platform? So yes, the structure of the talk today is going to be 2 anecdotes from projects at places that I worked. The first is going to be talking about scaling social media, and then the second is going to be about a re-architecture at a company that I worked at called Tumblr. and the post re-architecture project that happened there. And just a little bit about me to start. So I'm a senior engineer at Glossier, which is a digital-first beauty company. And I've worked across a lot of different companies, but primarily in social media. So I have so much to say about this topic, and I'm going to talk a little bit today, and feel free to come find me later to talk more. Okay. So first, let's talk about scaling, or why scaling communities is not like Romanesco broccoli. What is Romanesco broccoli? Basically, it's this. I'm not going to elaborate too much on that right now, but just look at this beautiful vegetable, and that's Romanesco broccoli. What's scaling? Scaling is creating a great experience for as many users as possible. So, in this first anecdote, I was working on a brand new social network, which is always so exciting. We were building a new social network from the ground up, and I was on the engineering team for that project. After we conceptualized what this app would be, who it's for, the kind of user research, coming up with the concept, we also built out the iOS app and a backend and set up an infrastructure. We then realized that our API requests were slow, really slow, like prohibitively slow, and it was a problem because obviously people have stuff to do. They can't wait for your app to finish loading. After some investigation, we noticed an issue with our infrastructure. So let me tell you more about sort of the problem and how we diagnosed it and then what we did. So we decided to use AWS Lambda for our infrastructure. AWS Lambda is an event-driven serverless computing platform. So a great way to kind of explain what this is to compare it with more traditional servers. So let's compare AWS Lambda with Amazon EC2. So with Amazon EC2, Amazon is providing, basically renting out servers to you. And you can set them up as you wish, and then when you need to scale up, you can get more servers, and basically it's just a way of accessing hardware. AWS Lambda is a little bit different. We're engineers here, and we love iOS engineers love abstraction. AWS Lambda is a more abstracted way of accessing Amazon's servers. So what AWS Lambda does is it's an infrastructure platform as a service. So rather than directly managing servers, you basically get computing resources only on demand, and I'll elaborate more on what that means. And these resources implicitly scale based on the number of requests they receive. And it's less customizable than Amazon EC2 instances. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what that means. So when you are using AWS Lambda, you're writing Lambda functions. This is a function that doesn't do anything. Oh, it's a little bit washed out, but it doesn't do anything, so you don't need to see it that well. So what happens when a user makes a request when a backend is using AWS Lambda infrastructure? It looks something like this. So user makes a request. On the first call, the Lambda needs to be initialized. And then the code in the Lambda, like the function we looked at before, can be called. And when that happens, we call it cold start. Whereas with subsequent requests that a user might make or other users might make, you have warm start. So the code in the Lambda can just run. So why is one cold and one warm? Well, a bunch of stuff has to happen on cold start. So on cold start, the Lambda needs to be set up to execute code. So some things need to happen. A container is mounted with all the basic tools that are needed so that the infrastructure can be used. There needs to be a programming language, there needs to be a runtime, and maybe a database that you set up will also be set up during this step. And when all of that is done, the Lambda code can be executed. Whereas on warm start, when all of that infrastructure is already set up and all the tools that you need to run that code are set up, the code can just run. So it's obviously faster. So why was our app very slow? Does anyone have an idea? Maybe don't chat out, but just think, why was our very small app so slow? Because nobody used it. So sad. Our app had not yet launched, so that's why nobody used it. But nobody was using this app. And so most starts were cold starts, and cold starts were very slow. Generally, as engineers, we think a lot about scaling up from an engineering standpoint, from a product standpoint, building products that are so amazing that so many people will want to use them all the time. But generally, when we're building new products, and particularly community products, we also need to ask ourselves, can it scale down? Is the experience and the underlying technology good for a community that will start small, as most communities do, and grow? People often skip ahead of that step where there's not a lot of users mentally, and build experiences that they imagine will work really well at a large scale. But communities need to be successful at a small scale before they can grow to a large scale. Now, if you think about the mechanics of a community app or a social media app, scale affects each aspect of the experience. So connecting, let's start with creating. So creating would be like sharing, posting an image, posting some really cool, hilarious content. Sharing might be when someone propagates that content throughout the platform. Connecting would be someone commenting and saying how hilarious and great your post was, or sending it to someone else in a message, but kind of the person-to-person connection aspect. And then reading is just kind of the consumption side. So each of these scale impacts each area and also how they interconnect. So if you think about it, if there are no people using a platform, creating content is more difficult because you don't know who your audience is, and there actually is no audience. Sharing is difficult because there's not a lot of content to share. Connecting is difficult because not only is there not a lot of content to share, but who would you share it with? You don't necessarily have a connection to other members of the community. And reading, for obvious reasons as well. There are a couple of ways to respond to this. One thing you can do is something that people do to deal with the cold starts with AWS Lambda is to kind of basically make requests periodically to keep them warm. So this example is sort of like keeping the community warm. You can basically artificially scale up a community by doing things like related to kind of growth marketing and community building. So you can pay people for their content. That's a great way to get them to use your platform. You can distribute the responsibility of giving people a good experience. So you can actually elevate some members of the community, like Reddit editors, right? Is that the right word, editor? And basically distribute the responsibility for cultivating a really good experience. And then you can also bring a large existing community onto your platform. So you can design your experience so that a group of people that's already connected can benefit from the tech that you're building. Another thing you can do is create a compelling small scale. So not all products need to have a huge audience. Small, trustworthy community makes people feel more comfortable sharing. When I first started using Instagram, basically nobody followed me, and then I also didn't accept requests to be followed, and it was great. Like, I only had a few followers. I posted whatever I wanted. It was very fun and free, and it had less pressure than other platforms. And obviously now Instagram is kind of a really important player in social media. The levers for joy and interaction on your social media app don't need to be like typical popularity-based interactions. So for example, you can design features that allow you to respond in a more kind of meaningful way to the other people on the platform so that they don't notice like, oh, I only got 3 likes because there's not a lot of people who even see my content. Maybe every person who sees the content can actually create a meaningful connection. And I really liked this tweet about this topic. about the concept of a single player experience in social media. So the tweet basically says that Instagram in the early days, because of filters, was able to be a really wonderful and fun to use experience, even if you were the single user of Instagram. And I think there's a really useful lesson there, which is that not every product needs to be huge, and there should be other things. Even if your community starts to grow, it takes a while for sort of the scale to be large enough and the experience to be coherent enough that people are really connecting to each other. So it's important that there are features that people love that they can use by themselves. So why is scaling communities not like Romanesco broccoli? Which is this. So Romanesco is a natural fractal. So fractals are shapes with self-similar forms at different scales. What that means is that at every scale, a fractal looks the same. So if you look at this vegetable and you looked at the zoomed in image, you can see that the zoomed out vegetable and the sort of pieces in this larger image are the same shape, which is just a very cool and beautiful thing. But communities don't scale like fractals. They don't look identical when they're very small and when they're very large. They're complex and different at every scale. And scale, like I mentioned when I was breaking down the different aspects of that community experience, scale has a huge and non-linear impact on users. Think about hosting a dinner party. Let's say you invited one person over to have dinner with you. You know what they like to eat, you know what their personality is like, and you know that you can give them a really good experience just one-on-one. But as you add each subsequent person to your dinner party, it becomes much more complex. Maybe the third person is a vegetarian, and you need to think about how to create a meal that they'll love. And then the fourth person is very introverted, and the fifth person is going through a hard time in their life. So you have to think about when you personally can't manage the entire conversation, how do you create an experience? How do you seat people, kind of host people in a way that gives every person and all of their complexity as a human a great experience? So I think that's a useful metaphor for building community apps and creating an excellent experience as communities scale. So what are the takeaways from this example? New community products can fail because of scale, not just because of a large scale, but because of a small scale and the lack of thoughtfulness around the small scale experience. The team that I was on chose a good technology for scaling up, implicit scaling, sort of easy scaling, but a bad technology for scaling down, and probably also a bad technology for building social media for other reasons, and for building kind of a larger app. The reality is you'll probably start at a small scale, and so don't design an experience that is doomed at that scale. Design an experience that can grow with your community. So that's the first example from my experience building social media apps. And now I'll talk about evolving features. And my favorite topic, which is user-generated content. I love user-generated content. It's the best. It's such an important part of why I love building community apps. And I just feel like when you give people a platform, so much weirdness and creativity comes out, and I just really enjoy seeing that content and following along, and sort of the way people become like celebrities just because of their cleverness and creativity. This next example is also a story about scale, but more than just scale, it's a story about how early technical decisions that teams make, the early technical decisions that teams make and how they can be gracefully transformed over time. So as engineers, like, the name of the game is evolving our technology, right? Things are always changing, Apple frameworks, our users, and we need to kind of figure out how to evolve. And especially when you're building technology in dialogue with a community, you need to figure out how to evolve as well. So this example is about Tumblr. Like I mentioned, I used to work at Tumblr. I was there for about 3 years. And it was an amazing place to work, full of awesome engineers and awesome human beings also. Now, this is the story of an evolution of social media. And it's also a story of two technology stacks, web and iOS. Let's go back. So in 2004, Facebook is launched. In 2006, Twitter is launched. In 2007, Tumblr is launched. And also in 2007, something very important to all of us happens, which is that the iPhone is launched. In 2007, social media was still all about self-expression through custom HTML, or as I like to call it, the Internet of Tags. And this is just a cool example. This is like predates Tumblr, but is just an example of the Wild West of web front-end stuff in those days and before. And so Tumblr was founded in 2007, during that time, and it was founded as a website building tool. So this is Tumblr's homepage in 2007. And while it began as a tool for creating websites, it became something a little bit different, which was a social network and a platform for basically, rather than having siloed standalone websites being the primary experience, it became more like a feed of content that people share. And when you're experiencing Tumblr, you're seeing different people's content mingling together on a feed. And this is Tumblr's homepage approximately today, with some awesome user-generated content as the background and a really cute cat. And here's some of Tumblr's content. No longer elegant standalone websites. It's just insanity of funny and creative content. We've got a horse with a little horse inside of the horse. You can use Tide Pods to do your laundry. That's what the one says on the right. So yeah, a lot of creativity, and obviously the product has changed a lot. Now, Tumblr revolves around posts. And the early vision of Tumblr is really encapsulated by its original post architecture. When I joined Tumblr in 2015, posts were stored as HTML. So just to jog everyone's memory as native app developers, these are HTML tags. And basically, HTML is used to describe the structure of a web page. Basically, browsers take HTML and figure out what to display and how. And why were posts originally stored as HTML? So if you think about it, and you think back to the time when the company was founded and what it was founded to do for users, HTML was a really important part of what expression meant in online culture when Tumblr was founded. So at the time, you would not want to constrain the way people could use HTML in Tumblr, because that was a very important, it wasn't just the content, like the words that you post, but the structure that they take and how you do a little bit of coding to make them your own. And even one of Tumblr's early features was actually the ability to build themes, so to help people build their own really awesome websites. And of course, browsers are built with this exact purpose. So the fact that posts were stored as HTML was very efficient and useful, because the clients, people were using Tumblr on the web, and so browsers could very easily figure out how to display HTML. This made a lot of sense until mobile apps came along, which now are a very important way that people obviously want to use social media. So by definition, browsers know how to build a UI using HTML, but native iOS apps don't. And so without going into too much detail, rendering HTML in the iOS apps that Tumblr started to build was very inefficient. There were a lot of complicated steps and a lot of constraints around what we could do and how we could deliver a really great experience. Now, there's one more important detail about the way posts were represented. We had a database that stored posts, and originally when Tumblr was founded, I showed an image before of posting on Tumblr. We have, Tumblr has different types of posts. There are text posts, photo posts, video posts, audio posts. And in the early days, there were just text and photo posts. And the database strategy was there are a bunch of columns in the database, and depending on the post type, each column has a different type of data. So generally, posts were represented as HTML, but then, for example, an image post, one column had image data rather than HTML. Now, if you think about a company with a very large scale, adding an additional column to a table at that scale is literally impossible, because that means changing every post that has ever been made on Tumblr, and it was extremely slow to do that. And so if there was ever a desire to add a new type of content to a post, in this old architecture, you would have to add a new column to the table, which was impossible. So Tumblr needed to evolve to a mobile-optimized post architecture that created a better user experience. And so I was working on community features at the time, on messaging and various other community features, but the Tumblr expression team, the team that focused on posts, created something called the Tumblr new post format. And there's a public spec for that format that you can check out at this link. Tumblr has third-party clients, so it's important that this kind of information obviously is communicated out. So what did this refactor look like? So originally you had a post represented by HTML. And what it became was a post that referenced an array, and each item in the array was JSON. And each JSON was something called a content block. And a content block basically represents a piece of content. And the content types that Tumblr initially supported with this refactor were video, text, image, link, and audio. And this is an example of how this response would look. You have a content key, and it has an array, and each item in the array is just a blob of JSON. In Swift, it looks something like this. So in the old architecture, every post directly references its content. So for example, a photo post directly references a photo. In the new post format, a photo post references an array of content blocks. And the content block is what directly references the photo. And content block is a protocol that each type of content on the Swift side conforms to. So this is a sort of simple and very powerful architecture. It allows you to reuse code across a lot of features anywhere where content is shown, anywhere where users can create content. So for example, you can create reusable views that are basically, that know how to display certain types of content blocks. So you can do something like support multiple types of content in a post, but then also easily add that kind of content to a message. And I know, having worked in social media for the past couple of years, that a lot of what users now want to do is actually communicate in direct messages with smaller groups of people. So they don't want to broadcast to a huge community, they just want to send a few of their friends something. So it's very important to be able to iterate with your community and abstract things in a way that is extensible. This concept of a client that uses a content type and some styling metadata to figure out how to display stuff sounds familiar. It sounds a lot like a browser. So this new architecture was essentially a simplified browser that Tumblr created in its clients to handle a specific subset of content types. So rather than supporting every type of HTML, Tumblr thought, what kinds of content do our users want to create, and created the ability to parse that content and display it in an awesome and extensible way. And the post database was simplified as well. So just a reminder of the initial architecture, you have a bunch of columns that have various types of data, and new columns basically can't ever be added. And it became simplified to something like this, where you actually have a single column that has, each type of content has an array of JSON objects that represent that post data. And all of this happened without users noticing a thing. That's something that's very powerful about this refactor as well, is that this was all done without the user experience actually changing. So this was a foundation for the user experience to change, but this did not change the user experience, and it just made the internals much better. New post forms was a smart and thoughtful refactor that became a foundation for supporting the features of the future. So what are the takeaways from this refactor? This is a quick summary of the takeaways that I'm about to share, and let's dive into each of them. So 1, you are who you are, timeless advice. 2, decouple evergreen and ephemeral features. 3, not everything needs to be strict, iOS engineers. 4, leverage Swift. And 5, how do you make fundamental changes to a product without anybody noticing anything? So you are who you are. Every social media app has the DNA of its early vision and early community. I think that's pretty much unavoidable, and it creates an interesting challenge for us as engineers. Tumblr began as a website builder and became a community platform. And so changes had to happen from an architectural standpoint to support that transition. The second takeaway is that it can be very useful to decouple evergreen and ephemeral features when building social media. So there's certain things that people will always want to do, and then there are things that will inevitably change on the other side. So the desire to share beauty and ideas won't change. In other words, the desire to share photos and text and other types of media won't change, but the way people want to express themselves, whether it's public or private or ephemeral, will change, and so it can be valuable to create a layer of abstraction there. Not everything needs to be strict. Being able to have a single column that has an array of stuff in it, validated JSON objects, is very extensible and means that Tumblr can now add new features without the need to change a very large amount of user data. Leverage Swift. The way that this was implemented was excellent also because of the way Swift was leveraged. And some of the great features of Swift, like enums and switch cases without using the default as a cheat, are really helpful when you're adding new features across a large code base. And also the use of protocols enabled the creation of a flexible yet structured contents array, which created an easy workflow of adding support for new content types. And finally, this general point about changing the internals of an app without anybody noticing is very powerful. And then on top of that change to the internals, you can make your user experience much, much better. And I just wanted to shout out the team that implemented this. I personally use this architecture now in all the social media apps that I build, now having left Tumblr. So what did we discuss today? We started by flipping the scale mantra on its head and discussed AWS Lambda and the importance of building community technology that can scale down. We then discussed Tumblr's post-architecture refactor and what it teaches us about the origins of that company, the origins of many companies like Tumblr that were founded at that time and are still very large and used by a lot of people, and how you can gracefully adapt the kind of early assumptions of your technology to the future. And then we talked about a bunch of other fun stuff like languages and fractals. Your app will have the DNA of its history and of the future as it evolves. Building community apps is an exercise in preparing for the future. People are fascinating. I mean, you're building technology for them, you learn a lot about kind of how they're changing, how the way they interact with each other changes, and so much more. It will be easier to create the future we want if we're not doing it alone. Community is so important and so vital, and when we're building community technology, we're building the foundations for, I think, a better world as well. And that's it. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to find me later.
Thank you, Tamar.